Have you ever failed at something, and suddenly it felt like you were the failure? Not that you failed a test, not that a project didn't work, but somehow your mind turned one moment into your entire identity. Today we're exploring a powerful idea from Zig Ziglar. Failure is an event, not a person. Now pause for a moment and really think about that. Failure is an event, not a label, not a personality, not a destiny, just an event. But here's the problem. Most people don't experience failure as an event. They experience it as a verdict about their intelligence, a verdict about their talent, a verdict about their worth. And when failure becomes identity, something dangerous happens. People stop trying, not because they lack ability, but because they believe the story about themselves is already written. So in this video, we're going to explore something deeper than motivation. We're going to examine why the human brain turns events into identity, how successful people mentally separate failure from self, why failure can actually become your greatest strategic advantage, and a simple mental framework to rebuild confidence after setbacks. Because once you understand this truth, failure stops being the end of your story. It becomes data for your next chapter. The dangerous moment. When failure becomes identity, failure itself is rarely the real problem. The real problem is interpretation. Two people can experience the exact same failure. One says, "Interesting, that didn't work." The other says, "I guess I'm just not good enough." Same event, different identity. And the difference between those two interpretations can change an entire life. Psychologists call this identity fusion. It happens when the brain merges what happened with who you are. You failed an exam, but your brain says, "I'm stupid." Your startup collapses. Your brain says, "I'm not meant for business." A relationship ends. Your brain whispers, "I'm unlovable." Notice the pattern. Events become conclusions. Moments become identities. But Zig Ziglar's quote interrupts that pattern with one simple correction. Failure is an event, which means it belongs in time. And anything that belongs in time can change. Why the brain personalizes failure. To understand this quote deeply, we need to understand something about the brain. Your brain is a meaning-making machine. It constantly asks, "What does this say about me?" When something goes wrong, the brain wants a quick explanation. Fast explanations help us move forward. But fast explanations are often wrong. Instead of saying, "This strategy didn't work," the brain chooses the faster story. "I'm not capable." Why? Because identity explanations feel complete. They close the case. But closing the case too early is how people abandon potential. Think about children learning to walk. They fall constantly, hundreds of times. But they never conclude, "I guess walking isn't for me." Why not? Because children treat failure correctly, as feedback, not identity. Somewhere along the journey to adulthood, many people forget that lesson, and suddenly, one bad outcome becomes a permanent self-judgment. Zig Ziglar's insight restores the original truth. Failure belongs to behavior, not identity. The difference between a fixed identity and a growth identity. Let's imagine two professionals. Both launch a project. Both fail. The first one says, "I failed. I'm not good at this. The second says, that approach failed. What can I improve? One protects identity. The other improves strategy. This difference is subtle, but over time it becomes enormous. A fixed identity mindset avoids situations that might reveal weakness. A growth identity mindset seeks situations that produce learning. And learning compounds. The most successful people in the world are not those who avoid failure. They are those who collect information from it faster than others. Every failed attempt becomes a map. Every mistake becomes data. Every setback becomes direction. But that only happens if failure remains what Zig Ziglar said it is, an event. Because events can be studied, events can be analyzed, events can be improved. Identity cannot. The hidden opportunity inside failure. There's something counterintuitive about failure. It often reveals information success hides. When things work immediately, people rarely investigate why. But when something fails, attention sharpens. Questions appear. Curiosity wakes up. Failure forces clarity. It asks, what assumption was wrong? What skill was missing? What system needs improvement? Many breakthroughs in science, business, and technology began with experiments that failed. But those failures were not treated as identity. They were treated as evidence. Evidence that a different path was needed. If failure becomes identity, learning stops. But if failure remains an event, learning accelerates. And learning is the only advantage that compounds forever. The identity reset framework. So the question becomes practical. How do you separate failure from identity in real life? Here is a simple framework called the event reset. When something goes wrong, ask yourself 5 questions. Event. What exactly happened? Describe it objectively. No drama, no identity statements, just facts. Variables. What factors influenced the result? Skill, timing, strategy, resources. Experiment. What part of this was an experiment? Experiments are allowed to fail. That's their purpose. Next adjustment. What will I try differently next time? Even a small improvement matters. Timeline. Remember, this moment is temporary. It's one event in a much longer story. This process transforms failure into something powerful. A structured learning cycle. And learning cycles build mastery. The myth of successful people. There is a myth that successful people experience less failure. Reality is the opposite. They experience more attempts, more experiments, more risks, which naturally produces more failure. But they do something differently. They don't internalize it. Instead of saying, I am a failure, they say, that attempt failed. Small linguistic difference, massive psychological difference. Language shapes identity, and identity shapes action. People who preserve identity continue acting. People who attack their identity withdraw, and progress always belongs to those who keep moving. When failure feels personal. Of course, some failures hurt deeply. A lost job, a broken relationship, a dream that collapses after years of effort. In those moments, separating event from identity feels difficult. Pain makes everything feel personal. So here is an important truth. Acknowledging pain does not mean accepting identity damage. You can say, this hurts, without saying, "This defines me." Pain is an experience. Identity is a decision. And sometimes the most courageous thing a person can say is, "This chapter was hard." But it is not the whole book. The identity you choose. Moving forward, imagine living with a different internal rule. Every time something goes wrong, you remind yourself, this is information, not identity. Suddenly, fear decreases, experimentation increases, learning accelerates. Confidence becomes more stable because it's no longer based on perfection. It's based on resilience, and resilience grows from one powerful belief. Your worth is not measured by isolated outcomes. It's measured by your willingness to continue. Failure will still appear in life. That's unavoidable. But when you understand Zig Ziglar's wisdom, failure becomes something very different. Not a verdict, not a label, not a life sentence, just an event. And events pass. Events teach. Events prepare you for the next opportunity. So tonight, ask yourself one simple question. What failure have I accidentally turned into identity? And then rewrite the sentence. Not, "I am a failure," but, "That event didn't work. And my story is still being written." Because once you separate who you are from what happened, you regain something incredibly powerful: the freedom to try again.